Happy New Year, family. January is upon us. For most, that's meant a return to school, a return to work, just a return to normalcy. If you live in Illinois, Indiana, or any of the northern states, as I do, it might mean an onset of frigid temperatures. As we speak, it is 5 degrees where I live. What's the temperature where you live? One of the things that I really love about January, and one of the reasons why this is one of my favorite months, is because it gives us an opportunity to celebrate and honor the life of Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. Now, in so many ways, Dr. King and the citizen activists of the civil rights movement were the ultimate champions of the Nguzo Saba. Yes, I said they were some of the ultimate champions of the Nguzo Saba. So today, we're going to take a critical look at one of the principles of the Nguzo Saba, which is actually our leading principle of the month, which is Umoja, and its application to one of the hallmark events of the civil rights movement, the Montgomery Bus Boycott. Let's do this. Ujai, Hetepu, Habari, and greetings. This is the Nguzo Saba 365. I am your host, Tanya Rutledge. The Nguzo Saba 365 is a socially conscious platform with one mission and one mission alone. That mission? To inspire people of African descent in the U.S. and throughout the diaspora to incorporate the Nguzo Saba in their daily lives. Through education about the principles and their importance, by providing real-life examples of the principles not only in practice but exemplified in practice, and by sharing concrete ways that each one of us can put the principles into practice today. Now, before we begin, I want to remind you to hit that like button, to subscribe to our channel, hit the notification bell if you'd like to see when we upload more content, and comment, of course, respectfully. And one more thing, family. Every time we do an episode, we want to incorporate something called Ujamaa in practice. And that is simply a shout out to those who own business in our community so that we can support each other in the spirit of cooperative economics. Now, I have had questions about 3 things, and I want to address those 3 things. The first thing was my hair. Yes, I do have sister locks. I have been getting questions about this for the last, I feel like a lot more in the last few months or a couple months. I do have sister locks. My sister locks have been maintained for the last 7 years by a woman named Karen Gooden, who is the owner and founder of K Monet. I will link, with her permission, her information down below so that if anyone is interested in sister locks, you can contact Karen. And I believe during the month of January, if you were watching this during January of 2020, she does have a special on sister locks, though she does more, way more than sister locks. She is a natural hair guru. So Karen, thank you so much for what you have done with my hair. It is beautiful, and I appreciate my sister locks every day that I get to be lazy when I wake up. Second question I've had was about my jewelry. Where do you get your jewelry? I tend to get jewelry during festivals, so sometimes I don't have the names necessarily of where I got the jewelry. I just knew I got it at the Kwanzaa Fest or at African Fest, but I can tell you I do have a number of little earrings, pieces, and stuff like that from Sherry's Earrings and Things, and that's where I got these beautiful earrings from Sherry's Earrings and Things. So I would like to, with her permission, include her information down below as well. And the third question that I have been getting from people is about my lipstick. Now, I don't know how anybody can see my lipstick from here, but I get my product from NVU, which is located in Hammond, Indiana. The owner's name is Lynn. I believe her last name is Stroud, and she is a wonderful person. She creates her own products. I know she does lip glosses. She does incredible body butters, incredible. And I believe her body butter is butter by girl. So you can't feel the suppleness of my skin, but I swear to you, my skin is supple. And part of that is the products that I use from Lynn at NVU Cosmetics and Butter by Girl. So those are my three shout out in Umoja in practice, and I will try to make sure that I do that before we get into the meat of every video. Now let's get back to business. In this episode, we will take a critical look at the principle of Umoja and its application to one of the hallmark events of the civil rights movement, the Montgomery Bus Boycott. Let's do this. For those who don't know or just need a refresher, the Montgomery Bus Boycott was a civil rights protest during which Americans of African descent refused to ride city buses in Montgomery, Alabama to protest segregated seating. In the 1950s, the Jim Crow system of segregation in the U.S. South was the literal law of the land and ensured that African Americans would remain second-class citizens in every sense of the word. The front section of the bus was for the whites, the back was for the blacks. If more whites got on than blacks, then blacks had to give up their seats. If more blacks were on the bus than whites, which was usually the case, blacks could never sit in the front row reserved for whites. So Montgomery's buses would often end up crowded with black women traveling home from work, standing with their bags in their hands next to empty seats that remained empty, waiting for white people. In fact, black folks had to enter into the front and then literally leave the bus after paying and enter through the rear exit. Sometimes the buses would take off before they even had an opportunity to board despite their payment. Now, the boycott took place from December 5th, 1955 to December 20th of 1956. So for roughly 1 year, a little bit over, about 90% of the black residents of Montgomery refused to ride the bus. Not for work, not for church, not for leisure, not for nothing. This was the largest U.S. demonstration ever against segregation. So the black leadership organized carpools, black taxi drivers charged discounted rates of 10 cents for black riders, which was the same fare as buses would normally charge. Many African American residents simply chose to walk to work or other destinations. The black leadership organized mass meetings to keep African American residents mobilized around the boycott. Now let's jump back a little bit. 4 days before this boycott began, Rosa Parks, an African American citizen in Montgomery, Alabama, was arrested and fined for refusing to yield her bus seat to a white man, and most of us know about this. Her actions were credited in history as the spark for the movement, and she was regarded as simply an individual citizen who just wanted to sit after a hard day's work. Now, what many people do not know is that 9 months before Rosa Parks, a 15-year-old girl named Claudette Colvin in the same city, same bus system, was forcibly removed from the bus, handcuffed, jailed for doing the exact same thing. Now, leadership did not feel at the time that Colvin was the suitable representative for boycotting the bus system. Rosa Parks was married. She was secretary of NAACP, well known and respected. So she was actually in many ways chosen to be the face of the movement because her image was simply at that time more appealing and less controversial. And we'll talk a little bit more about that definitely in a moment. Now, of course, the U.S. Supreme Court ultimately ordered Montgomery to integrate its bus system. And one of the leaders of the bus boycott, a young pastor that you may have heard of, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., emerged as a prominent leader of the civil rights movement. So now we are caught up on the history, folks, so let's talk. The concept of Umoja was so pervasive in this movement that if you separated Umoja or unity from this movement, there was no movement. So I want to delve deeper into this concept in 4 fronts: the leadership, the both real and symbolic victim turned heroine, the casualties, and the collective citizens, and how all 4 of these people or groups had to be united in a certain way in order for all this to work. So let's talk leadership, family. Edie Dixon of the NAACP and Joanne Robinson of the Women's Political Council, both of Montgomery, and other leaders as well, have been tossing out the idea of a boycott for months. But they waited. They did not boycott at the time that this idea was coming out. They waited in unity. And that concept of in unity is important here. It could have been that one organization, one person kind of jumped the gun in terms of this boycott, but they didn't. They worked together and they all waited. They waited for the right time. They waited to decide on the correct formal leadership. They waited even for the right symbolic victim, if you will. In the end, they chose Dr. Martin Luther King. Collectively, organizations came together. The leadership that actually sort of spawned the boycott and that piece of the movement, they chose Dr. Martin Luther King. They did not choose themselves. Now, both Edie Nixon and Joanne Robinson were both leaders in their own right. They were both leaders. Remember who they were in this movement. These names that you have never probably heard of before. These were leaders. These were people who had conversations, discussions, planning around this prior to there actually being a movement to start this boycott. But they helped to choose Dr. Martin Luther King, who at that time was not super well known. This was a young pastor of the Dexter Avenue Church, and he was not well known. They didn't come out with 1,000,001 reasons why they should be the leader of the movement. They did not at the time come out to media or write a telltale book or something about why they made a better leader than Dr. Martin Luther King. They looked at the movement itself and what the movement needed. They felt as if Dr. Martin Luther King brought what the movement needed, and he was chosen to be the leader. They understood that everyone had to come together for the interest of this boycott, which was going to spark a movement that would be beneficial to all collectively. So they didn't just say, hey, we're going to sponsor this as the NAACP or as the Political Women's Council or as even the Sleeping Car Porters. They worked together to ensure that the leadership would be able to take this fight to the very end. And just to backtrack a little bit, the leadership that started the idea of the boycott initially also made sure to press on Montgomery's black ministers because they understood the power, particularly at that time, that was in the black church, and that this was where black people were at in droves, and that this could be a way to communicate to Montgomery's black citizens. Now, even though most of us have not heard of some of the leaders in this movement that later on came together to form Montgomery Improvement Association, or the MIA, at that time, anybody who was in this movement understood the gravity of what it was that they were taking on, whether we know their names in 2020 or not. Obviously, Dr. Martin Luther King took on a great deal of personal risk for himself and his family by becoming the leadership in this movement. However, anyone who was associated with the movement also took on a significant level of danger. So let's just think about this. And if an individual citizen who does not have a leadership role stands behind this movement, that person's life was in jeopardy. So when we look at the people that were leaders in this movement that many of us haven't heard of, what type of risk did they take on by becoming leadership at the time in this movement, even though not necessarily at the top or at the total forefront? In order to withstand this level of personal risk, leadership had to stay united. Had they turned on each other, this would not have been a successful venture. It wouldn't have. Had they succumbed to the amount of scrutiny, death threats that they had gotten and not locked arms and stayed together to run the course, they would not have been successful. Had they spent their time arguing about whose organization was the most influential in the coming together of this movement and the coming together to maintain this boycott, that would have been wasted time and energy. It would have taken away from the cohesion of the group, and they would not have been successful. So now let's move on to talk about the real and symbolic victim turned heroine in this movement, and I am particularly talking about Ms. Rosa Parks. Now, even though she has been widely honored in her later years, when we fast forward past the Montgomery Bus Boycott, we see her glorified in museums, we see her picture on stamps, we see her revered as one of maybe 5 figures during Black History Month that stands for the struggle, and her image is used in order to promote the idea of non-violent protest to make change. Now, Rosa Parks, though given accolades later in life, suffered greatly for her act on that fateful day. She ended up moving out of the town that she lived in eventually. She was fired from her job. She was actually fired from more than one job. She received multiple death threats for years afterwards. Despite her accolades, Rosa Parks gave up a lot to be the face of this movement. And as I alluded to earlier, she was in certain ways chosen to be the face of the movement, but I want to make sure that I make something clear. This was not the first time that Rosa Parks had refused to get up from her seat. It was not the first time that she protests. She was not new to the struggle. As I mentioned previously, she was the secretary of the NAACP. Her and her husband were very active in this movement before the bus boycott and after the boycott. Now, another thing that people don't know about Rosa Parks is that she actually came into disagreement with Dr. King and other leaders of Montgomery's struggle during the civil rights movement in terms of how to proceed, and she sort of broke from the movement in a way. And this was back in 1957. This was not something that happened like 20 years later. This was back when this was happening. But what you didn't hear is you didn't hear Rosa Parks vocalizing to the media that she felt as if Dr. King and the others were going in the wrong direction. That's not something that you heard her say. That's not something that is common knowledge. She actually, in later years, during the mid-60s, ended up becoming a part of the Freedom Now Party. She actually supported the Freedom Now Party, befriended Malcolm X, who she regarded as a personal hero. She moved actually to Detroit and collaborated with the League of Revolutionary Black Workers, Republic of New Africa. She actually also supported the Black Panther School in Oakland. She organized for the freedom of political prisoners in the United States. And I mean, the list goes on and on and on. But what you did not hear her doing at any point in time, at least not in a public way that would interfere with the civil rights movement, is place herself in a position of adamant and public disagreement with those in the movement, because she honored the principle of Umoja. She understood that you can do more than one thing at at the same time, she understood that we don't all have to do the same thing. If I am in disagreement with the direction in which something is going, I can always work to go in another direction. I do not have to tear down that in which I disagree. I can simply disagree, but understand that there is more than one way to skin a cat. And that's really the way that I look at Rosa Parks. She was chosen for the movement, but not out of thin air. This is a woman who worked for the position that she took in the movement, and continued to work for the betterment of her people, honoring the principle of Umoja. And she did not spend her days trying to defame those in the movement in which she disagreed. So family, that concludes part 1 of our Dr. Martin Luther King birthday special. Please stay tuned for part 2, where we will continue to explore the role of Umoja in the Montgomery Bus Boycott. Until then, Irihiru, Kwaheri, and good evening. We are the Nguzo Saba 365.
Kwaheri.